In my last two videos, I talked about just how much the Bible has changed over the centuries, and I gave examples of several significant changes that have remained in our modern Bibles, despite being later additions to or subtractions from the text. Today, we're going to look at 6 more changes that have been made to the Bible over the centuries. But before we dive in, I want to stress again that these are just some of the many changes that we know about. There is a massive time gap between when Jesus lived and died, when the Gospels were probably written, and when our oldest surviving copies were actually penned. We have no idea just how much or how little of our modern Bibles accurately represent what was actually in the original autographs, because we don't have any originals. That said, let's explore what we do know. This first textual variant isn't exactly an example of a particularly significant change that drastically altered the meaning of the text, but it is quite possibly one of the funniest, and it's a great example of just how error-prone the copying process was. If you crack open your Bible to Hebrews 1:3, you'll find a verse that talks about how Christ sustains all things by his powerful word. And this is how the verse appears in most of our manuscripts. But in Codex Vaticanus, one of our oldest, most reliable copies of the New Testament, we find a slightly different reading. Instead of Christ sustaining or upholding all things by his powerful word, he instead manifests all things by the power of his word. Because this is only the difference of 2 Greek letters, pheron versus phoneron, it was likely a simple copying mistake by the original scribe. However, a later scribe came along and caught the mistake. Probably by comparing the text to other manuscripts at their disposal. They erased most of the word and replaced it with the original, more accurate variant of the verse. However, centuries later, another scribe noticed the change and erased the correct reading and changed it back to the mistaken version, adding an angry note in the margins. Fool and knave, can't you leave the old reading alone and not alter it? Amazing. Probably one of the largest known biblical alterations comes from the book of Mark. If you happen to be unfortunate enough to drive through the armpit of America, you might just happen upon one of these churches in Appalachia where the congregation dances around holding poisonous snakes. They do this because at the end of Mark's gospel, it states that these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will drive out demons, they will speak in new tongues, they will pick up snakes with their hands, and when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them. They will place their hands on the sick and they will get well. There's just one problem. The entire ending of Mark is a later addition. The Gospel of Mark originally ended in an incredibly unsatisfactory way. 3 women go to Jesus' tomb and his body isn't there. A young man tells them that Jesus has risen. They run away terrified and they tell no one. The end. A later scribe reading this ending decided it wasn't good enough.
Are you serious?
And added 12 additional verses, including Jesus appearing to his disciples and telling them to go and do all of this nonsense. Someone should probably tell that to all of the pastors who keep dying of snake bites. One of my favorite examples, though, of how the Bible has been changed over time is from the Old Testament. It's a verse that refers to God's, or Yahweh's, father and brothers. See, Judaism wasn't originally monotheistic. It emerged from a backdrop of polytheistic traditions, and many of the Mesopotamian stories are incorporated into the Old Testament. Parts of the creation tradition, the flood myth, and even the names of the local deities. You see El, Asherah, Baal, Chemosh, and others mentioned throughout the Bible. They're referred to as actual gods. In Genesis, you have God saying, "Let us make man in our image." You have him competing with the gods of Egypt, commanding his people not to worship other gods, for he is a jealous God. And we have many references to and descriptions of the divine council. Even the name of God, Yahweh, was a Canaanite storm deity who the Israelites chose to worship. If you're familiar with the Canaanite pantheon or have read Ugaritic texts which predate the Old Testament, or if you've studied ancient Mesopotamian mythology from which the Jewish Bible pulled much of its inspiration, the stories of the Old Testament actually make a lot more sense. Like in Deuteronomy 32:8-9, where it states, "When Elion, or God Most High, gave to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of man, he fixed the bounds of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God, or the B'nai Elohim. For Yahweh's portion was his people. Jacob was the lot of his inheritance." El Elyon, or El, the Most High, was the name of the Canaanite deity at the head of the pagan pantheon. And according to Canaanite tradition, Yahweh was one of the sons of El. In this verse, when El is dividing up the nations, each one of his sons is receiving their portion. And it states that El gave Jacob, the nation of Israel, to Yahweh as his inheritance. But because this strongly clashes with the monotheistic interpretation of the Bible, later scribes altered it to say, "He fixed the bounds of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel."
He set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. Well, Israel's not in existence when the nations are divided. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
But if you go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, our earliest texts, you'll see multiple references in Deuteronomy 32 to the sons of God. And Yahweh was one of them, along with the rest of his siblings. But nearly 1,000 years later, when the Masoretic text was written, these references to the sons of God were entirely edited out.
Somebody removed these letters from the Dead Sea Scroll reading, and they inserted 3 new letters to read B'nai Yisrael, sons of Israel. Again, we don't know when that happened, but we know that it did.
Every time that the Bible is updated or translated, some change, however small, is inevitable. If you open up the 1984 edition of the New International Version to Matthew 25:29, you'll see a verse quoting Jesus as saying, "For everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him." However, in Greek, this passage and many others in the New Testament are understood to be using a gender-inclusive he, which can refer to both men and women. So when Biblica released a new edition of the New International Version in 1995, and again in 2005 and 2011, they altered the text to include more inclusive language, including at times the gender-neutral pronouns they, them, so as to more accurately represent the original text. They also changed the words mankind and man to human beings and people. I should emphasize that this was before pronouns had somehow become political, and yet despite this actually being both more accurate and more inclusive, they faced major backlash and opposition from evangelical conservatives in the US for making these editorial choices. But as triggered as some people get over pronouns, that is far from the most egregious change that the editors of the NIV have made to the Bible. When encountering internal contradictions between two passages, they've been known to simply edit out the differences. But I've already covered that in more detail in my videos on Bible contradictions. But it's not just the NIV that will alter verses willy-nilly to fit an agenda. In Exodus 21:22-25, there is a legal text describing the punishment for a very specific scenario. If 2 men are fighting and one of them strikes a pregnant woman, causing her to miscarry, he has to pay a fine. But if he accidentally kills the woman, his punishment is death. This is how the NASB translated the passage in 1977. And this translation accurately represents our oldest surviving Hebrew text and is how pretty much any Jewish rabbi would translate this verse. And it strongly indicates that a fetus isn't a person, because the punishment for killing a woman is death, but the punishment for causing her to miscarry is a mere fine. The same punishment as if the perpetrator had accidentally harmed the woman elsewhere on her body. And this is how Jewish rabbis, the foremost experts in the Torah, have unanimously interpreted this passage through the ages. This interpretation is in keeping with long-held Jewish traditions, which dictate that a fetus is mere water until 40 days of gestation, and then it is viewed as part of the woman's body, with no rights or identity of its own, right up until the moment of delivery when it breathes its first breath. Until the moment that the child is born, the woman's rights always took precedence. But in 1995, in the heat of the abortion debate, the Lockman Foundation deliberately altered the text of the updated NASB from the correct word miscarry to the mistranslation gives birth prematurely. And this is how nearly every modern version of the Bible now translates the verse. But it's absolutely not the meaning of the original Hebrew text. Now, I used to believe that the Bible was divinely inspired and its message was perfectly preserved by God through the ages. But in actuality, there have been countless copying errors, deliberate alterations, and mistranslations of the text every time that it's been copied. And there continue to be more each time that a new version or translation of the text emerges. I've covered just 6 of them today, but are there any notable ones that I've missed? Let me know in the comments below. If you haven't seen my last 2 videos on changes made to the Bible, make sure that you check those out, or watch my videos on internal contradictions in the Bible. I have an entire library of great content like this on my channel. If you're new, please consider subscribing. And if you've been around for a while, videos of this caliber take a massive amount of time and resources to produce, and while my content will always be free, I'm only able to do this full-time thanks to support from viewers like you. Right now, I believe that the largest threat to personal freedoms and democracy in the West is Christian nationalism, and I know that my content has made a significant impact in de-radicalizing people and normalizing healthy skepticism. But I can't do this alone. If you want to help my channel to reach more people, would you consider making a per-video pledge on patreon.com/holykoolaid, or you can make a one-time donation on PayPal. Thank you so much to everyone for your ongoing support, and as always, dare to be curious, but don't drink the Kool-Aid. Fool and knave.